My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. I'm Gary Holmes, and here with me today is Jim Robinson. Today, we're really going to shake things up. Are you excited, Jim?
I really am.
I don't think I've been as excited about anything since I heard Kevin Costner's Boston accent in 13 days. So this is going to be a great day. Today, we're joined by our friend and mentor, Ken Khachigian, who has written a fascinating new book called Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. This is must reading for anyone interested in what these two giant figures were really like and what it was like to work for them and write for them.
Gary, you're right. Ken Khachigian sat at the elbow of both these presidents at important stages of their careers, and he was without question Ronald Reagan's favorite speechwriter. In previous episodes of our podcast, we featured a number of film portrayals of Richard Nixon, and we're looking forward soon to doing a podcast on the new Reagan biopic that has just come out. One film we particularly want to ask Ken about today is Frost Nixon, in which Ken is actually portrayed by a Hollywood actor. So I guess he's really made it. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, we should point out that both you and I know Ken Khachigian and consider him a master writer and political strategist who's played a significant role in our own careers. In my case, I think Ken is responsible for something like half of the jobs I've ever had. And Gary, I trust you feel the same.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Ken was my boss in the 1984 Reagan Bush reelection campaign, and he helped me jumpstart my career after that. So I'm really grateful to him. So without further ado, let's bring on our special guest, Ken Khachigian. Ken, how are you?
Good. Good to be with you, Gary and Jim. Good to see you guys, or good to hear from you.
So let's get started. So one question that Jim and I were discussing even before the book came out was, why now? Why did it take so long? You have so many great stories and insights in this book. We've been eagerly awaiting this for years. So why now?
Well, first of all, as I tell people, people always said you should be writing a book, and then and I'm always asked, why did you wait so long? And of course, one of the main answers I had to make a living, uh, so
Right.
I didn't have time. What happened was we were on a cruise in Europe and off the coast of Italy, and one of these cruises, they take these day tours off into these villages, and which are frankly a little boring. So I stayed on the boat that day, and I finally took out a pen and paper and started making notes and writing. And you have to start with the first word when you write a book. So that was May of 2019. So that's little over 5 years ago, and I started writing. And then when I got back to California, in earnest, I began writing and opened up my files. And then I realized that I had an awfully lot to talk about. I started mainly writing about, wanted to write about my years with President Reagan because, as Gary and Jim, both of you know, I was very senior, had a very senior position with the president, very close to him. Access to the Oval Office, and flew with him on Air Force One and spent time with him at Camp David and on the ranch, and uh, had a lot of meetings with him. And but then after writing just a few pages, I realized that I couldn't write about Reagan without writing about how I got introduced to him, and that was through my time with President Nixon, and how much I had learned. In other words, I got my PhD at the University of Reagan, but I got my bachelor's and master's degree at the College of Richard Nixon. So
Okay, well, speaking of Nixon, let's start with him then. He's one of the most widely covered figures by historians, journalists in Hollywood, yet still somewhat mysterious and elusive as a person. You tell a lot of really interesting anecdotes in your book, but what are some of the Nixon qualities that our listeners may not know about, things that all the so-called experts might be missing?
I think there was a side to him that people don't understand, that he was much more communicative than people feel. They think that Nixon was awkward in dealing with people and uh, cold and remote, and yet he could be just the opposite. President Nixon could be very engaging and very warm and communicative in small groups, and he was actually adept at small talk because he could, if you got him talking about politics, he was very good at it. He was very practiced at it. Now he didn't have the same sense of warmth that you was conveyed by Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan he was an actor, and uh, he had years and years of portraying roles where he conveyed that sense of warmth. But Reagan actually was not as comfortable around uh, people that he didn't know. But Nixon was over the years had become very adept at communicating with people. So Nixon could be in a group of strangers and might start making inquiries about where they were from, or what they did, or about their children, and he was better at small talk than people think, and especially once you got him engaged. And uh, people know that who had visited with him over dinner and had dinner conversations with him, how fascinating he was and interesting he was, and he he was very generous he was always never um, never failed to call me at New Year's or Christmas to wish me well over the holidays, and always writing personal notes on special occasions. So he had personal touches on a lot of things. So those kinds of things, he was much more engaging than people think.
Ken, this is Jim. Maybe you can help me with something I've been trying to figure out for years. I've been an unabashed Nixon fan since I was 6 years old and went door to door with my father to hand out literature in the 1960 campaign. My conundrum, personally, and I think with a lot of people, is why? He wasn't particularly conservative. It's not like a Ronald Reagan conservative. Yet, through all the trouble and turmoil and, yes, mistakes, he had and has an incredibly loyal fan base that really has never wavered. And you're probably one of them. I'm one of them. Why do you think this is? What accounts for it?
Well, partly is because uh, he was always engaged with the party. He was not uh, he didn't pick sides in terms of, like, when it came to campaigning for candidates. Uh, when he was vice president, or whether it was in office or out of office, he traveled around the country helping other candidates. He campaigned for the party loyally. He was always completely loyal to his friends. He spoke out for his causes with passion. So I think I think when he showed that sense of loyalty to others, people saw that virtue in him, and rewarded that loyalty back. And I think they just saw that he was always a fighter, and I think they respected that in him over the years. I mean, there were a lot of Republicans who might have been conservatives, more conservative than he was, but were less passionate about their views, or were more reluctant to go out and help out the party, or help others. And Nixon was a total loyalist. If he had friends, whether they're liberal, conservative, or whatever, he was if they were friends to him, he was very loyal back, and I think they saw that in him.
I think there was my sense also is, that was a time when he was president, it was a time of great divides in the society. And I think people saw in him a resistance to the elites, a reaction against some of the elite institutions and the sort of the snobs of the East Coast upper crust that just sort of rang some visceral bells in people like myself and others. I think that might have explained it too.
Well, that's for sure, and that came from his roots. He was one of us. In that sense, he was a lot like Reagan. He came from very modest, historically Midwest roots, and came from a small town, lived in a very small house, shared with his family, and he was not an elitist. And throughout his career, he fought the establishment. So I think that was I think the people respected that in him, and the fact that he throughout his career he was willing to take on the big guys, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the fact that they hated him back was something that he wore. He wore something on his. He wore it as a badge of honor. Not he didn't say, as he often said, wasn't going to suck up to him, and they didn't like that, but his supporters respected that in him.
Hmm.
Well, it's the old the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Sure, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was a mirror opposite syndrome too, if you remember, Ken. Remember the so-called Nixon enemies list? Every left winger wanted desperately to be on that list as kind of a bona fide.
Yeah, there's no question. It's what's really interesting when every politician has an enemies list. They just don't call it that
Right.
by name. And if you want to get an instruction in hardball politics, all you need to do is pick up Ben Bradley's book about Jack Kennedy, called Conversations with Kennedy, and where Bradley learned the Kennedy rule about don't get mad, get even. And Kennedy had an unspoken enemies list. So it's every politician has one. They just didn't put a name to it.
Well, someone that was not on his enemies list was David Frost.
Right.
David Frost had been in to interview him even before these Frost Nixon interviews
Right.
in his retirement, which is something that they don't really talk about so much in the movie.
Right.
But one of the most famous portrayals from the Nixon saga are those interviews with Nixon when he was ex-president, and the subsequent Broadway play and the movie that was released years later. You played an important role in all of that. Can you hit the highlights for us on what you did to help prepare Nixon for those interviews?
I was working on the helping as a researcher on his memoirs in beginning in 1975 when I returned to San Clemente to help him out, and there was a purpose for doing his memoirs and the David Frost interviews. There were two reasons for both. One was financial, because Nixon had big expenses, legal expenses and other expenses after resigning. So he needed to get his financial house in order. And to do that, he had writing the book to get a big advance, and B, doing the David Frost interviews for which he was paid. That was one reason. The other reason to do the memoirs and the Frost interviews was to get out his message and on his administration, to get his record out, but importantly, to put Watergate behind him, very frankly. And so I was working as a researcher on his memoirs, along with Diane Sawyer, who had the office next to me at the compound, and Frank Gannon, who was the lead researcher for Nixon. And Diane was the chief Watergate researcher for the memoirs. So, and I did mostly political and domestic policy. Nixon asked me to take off time from working on the memoirs to take the lead as the head research person to prepare him for the David Frost interviews, because that's the kind of thing I did in the White House when I worked in the White House, preparing for political interviews and political matters. It was sort of in my wheelhouse. I stopped working on the memoirs and I started preparing briefing books on different subjects for the Frost interviews. And Diane took some time off from working on the Watergate portion of the memoirs, and she started doing some Q&A under my direction and coordination on the Watergate portion. And then Ray Price, who was Nixon's chief speechwriter in the White House, came out to help as well. And he did some help on some Q&A questions and answers, largely on some of the foreign policy matters. But at the end of the day, Nixon asked me to coordinate all this and to make sure all the briefing books were in order. We prepared, I don't know, something, I have a photo in my office of a stack of about 25 briefing books on different issues that we prepared for Nixon to study for these interviews on all different subjects, whether it was domestic policy, foreign policy, Watergate. We knew he was going to be asked about Vietnam and the bombing of Cambodia, the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, and all kinds of things that people don't even know about today, but that were big issues in the 1970s. He was going to be asked about Kent State, what happened about the shooting of the students at Kent State. And so it was my job to do that. And then every day, as we did the preparation, I would probably twice a day have sit-downs with Nixon where we do a back and forth, discussing the progress on the interviews, and then doing a little bit of game planning on how it might go. But Nixon didn't prepare by doing so-called murder boards. That's not the way he did it. He prepared for the interviews by studying his briefing books and making notes on them. And they're somewhere in the archives or the Nixon records with all his notes on them. But we didn't do practice sessions. That was not his style. We didn't do practice Q&As with him. He studied these briefing books, made notes on them, and we did discuss how to approach the questions of dealing with some of the big issues that were controversial. And of course, we discussed how we were going to approach the issue of Watergate, and that's where we got into agitated staff discussions, because there's disputes within the staff on how we should approach this.
So you write about all this in your book. There's a very fascinating chapter on this, which I, again, hope everyone will buy and read, because it's really interesting. They ended up making a movie out of this, and this is a movie podcast, so we have to ask a couple of movie questions here, or at least one. What did you think of the movie Frost Nixon, and what was it like to see yourself portrayed on the screen? Was that weird?
Well, I didn't play much of a big role in the movie, so
no. But even so, I mean,
it was fairly modest. However, the movie itself was largely entertainment, of course.
Yeah.
It bore little resemblance to the actual interviews themselves, other than the fact, to the extent that the movie used actual dialogue from the interviews themselves, they were accurate. But when the movie departed from the actual dialogue of the interviews and meandered into extraneous discussions, trying to portray meetings and other things outside the actual interviews themselves, such as there was an occasion when there was suggested that Nixon made some kind of drunken phone call to David Frost, which was absolute pure fantasy. I mean, that was just concocted out of thin air. And actually, Ron Howard, the producer, came to see me in my office in San Clemente with the screenwriter, Peter. His name is Peter Morgan.
Yeah.
And they had provided me the script ahead of time, to their credit, to take a look at it and ask me my views on it and see if I had any ideas about the script. So Ron Howard had made quite a stir. There was a Starbucks down below my office, and nobody could believe that Ron Howard was at Starbucks below there in San Clemente. But anyway, he came up to my office with the double latte or whatever it was, and we visited, and along with his screenwriter, Peter Morgan, and we chit-chatted about the movie, and then they asked me what I thought about the script, and I said, well, a lot of this doesn't bear much resemblance to actuality, and they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, like that scene where you've got Nixon making this drunken phone call to David Frost over in his suite at the wherever it was, the Beverly Wilshire, I think, or fancy hotel where he was staying, and they sort of chuckled, and Peter Morgan says, well, Ken, after all, this is entertainment. So
Well, Peter Morgan went on to do the Crown, about the Queen of England and Queen Elizabeth. Most of that is all conjecture too. So I mean, I guess he cut his teeth on fantasy working on this movie.
Well, that's the whole nature of it, and of course you even get there's some of that in this movie there's quite a bit of that in this movie on Reagan, frankly, on the entertainment side of it. Hollywood can't help itself
Right.
to be melodramatic about things and hype things up. But so I tell people the Frost Nixon movie itself bears very little resemblance to what we went through with these interviews. And if they really want to know what happened, read my book. And I think I think that's the most dramatic chapter 3 on the Frost Nixon interviews. I think it's written fairly dramatically, and if you read it's sort of a blow by blow, bit by bit, and the dialogue is authentic because I kept diaries back then of all my conversations with President Nixon. And so everything in it is based on the diaries that I kept, records of my conversations. So that's all extremely authentic, and nothing is made up.
What I found most hard to accept in the movie was this idea they were sort of celebrating and patting themselves on the back that they had given Richard Nixon the trial that he never had and got him to make big confession. But from what I heard in those interviews, and then the later interviews with Frank Gannon and in all the statements he made, he basically said the same thing about Watergate in his whole presidential life, which is that, he let people down. They were mistakes of the heart, not the head.
Right.
He went up to the edge, but he didn't go over the edge legally, and he thought
Right.
he was dealing with it as a political problem. And yet they seemed to think that they had gotten wrenched out of him this dramatic confession of being a criminal or something. And that I found just didn't ring true at all to me.
That's a very good point. He felt that arguably that it could be said that on small matters that people could say that things that he had said might have misled the public on the small matters, but he always argued that on the big things that he did not mislead the American public.
Mm-hmm.
But the perception was um, that he had, quote, lied. But he said, I don't feel that on the big issues, I did not mislead the American people. Still, if, what he needed to do, what he needed to achieve with those Frost interviews, he needed to get Watergate behind him, just like he had to do in the book. And he could not go forward with his life until that was done. And you had Frost himself had to, he had invested a whole lot of money in this matter. David wanted to get some drama out of this and make some money. And Bob Zelnick, who I became really very close friends with later, was a pretty honest broker. He was an attorney, and he wanted to have more factual. The guy who was the sort of prosecutor here was young Zelnick called me Young Reston, Scotty Reston's son, James Reston, the famed New York Times columnist. It was his son who had these notions of Nixon having some psychological issues with his mother or some weird stuff, and he was really maniacally anti-Nixon. And at the end of the day, what Nixon's goal was is that, look, I've got to give them, I've got to say something that lets them know that I feel that I understand that the American people sense that there was some wrongdoing and that and I acknowledge it. So I better get this behind me. So it was sort of an expiation, I would think. And like I say in the book, what he said at the party we had at my house afterwards, in effect, he said, now it's behind us and we can move forward. And it's true. Once he got that out of the way, they couldn't say to him anymore that, look, you haven't spoken out about Watergate. And he said, look, I did. It's all there. I said it to David Frost, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore. And so now I can go on with my life. And then he put it behind him. He put that behind him. He put the book behind him. He did some foreign travel. He moved to New York, and then he wrote 9 best-selling books. And pretty much after that, he didn't have to talk about Watergate anymore.
I never thought of it like that. That's really interesting. To the movie's credit,
fairly shrewd on his part.
Yeah. To the movie's credit, they did give you the mustache that you used to have, but they made you much pudgier than you ever were or are.
Yeah, I was not that little roly-poly guy that.
Yeah. Gary, do you have anything more on President Nixon before
No,
we
I
turn
mean,
to
I have a million more questions, but I think we need to talk about Reagan because most of the book is about Reagan, and there's a lot in there that really interests me a lot. So
Sure. Well, Ken, you probably know I did a bit of writing for Reagan myself. It was my first job.
Yeah.
And I helped draft some of those radio commentaries that he did between the governorship and the presidency under Pete Hannaford.
Mm-hmm.
But you were the real deal, drafting some of the seminal Reagan speeches that came to define the 1980s. In your book, you described the whole process of what it was like to write for him. And I thought it was very interesting that you also owned up to the numerous times when the president took a very sharp editing pen to what you had prepared. That's something that rankles every speechwriter, even when they don't want to admit it. How much care and attention and focus did he pay to his big speeches when he was president?
Well, it always depended on how much time he had. So if he had the time, he did put a lot of care and attention to it. So let's say, take an example, the inaugural address. That was very important to him, and he was not yet president, and he didn't have to make a lot of big decisions on foreign policy or economic policy. And personnel was the decisions were being made slowly. So, and he had I had given him a draft, but he had time he had 5 hours on an airplane trip back from Washington to California, and so he was able to do a lot of rewriting on it in the way he wanted it, using my draft and his own thinking on the really important economic speeches. And of course, I never forget the dates, February 5th and February 18th, a TV address to the nation on February 5th, and then a joint session speech on February 18th. Those were the big speeches laying out the economic recovery plan. Those were very important to him. And on both of those speeches, he devoted a great amount of time editing because they were critical to his setting the stage for his economic recovery. And in each case, he would take them to Camp David and spend an afternoon editing and reworking. If it came to something like a proclamation or something like that, he didn't waste his time on working on those because I don't think he even saw what came through the process. Now, another example was the speech he gave the day of the assassination attempt at the Washington Hilton. That speech he did spend some time working on. I had assigned that. I couldn't write everything. I mean, I had a small staff. I was overloaded in the first 100 days of the administration, so I assigned that one to Mari Mossing, and now she's married to George Will, so it's Mari Will is her name. And she drafted, it was her maiden speech for the president, and then I edited it pretty heavily, but that went into the president, and because he was a former union member, he wanted to edit that pretty heavily himself, and so he made a lot of edits on it, I think. But again, it always depended on how much time he had. So, like the convention speech in 1984, he did a huge heavy edits on that because he got so angry with what the Democrats had said about him at their convention in San Francisco that he wanted to strike back. So he added everything but the kitchen sink. I was fine with it. It didn't bother me at all. But all the squishes and wishy-washes and on our staff, the Worthland and Jim Baker and Darman all thought, oh my gosh, he's attacking the Democrats, everything they didn't want. And then they leaked everything to all their thoughts to David Broder and the New York Times in order to get negative press against the president after the '84 convention speech. But it was exactly what he wanted because he edited it himself. I write a you need readers need to. That's one of the I think fascinating thing. I have to say I'm being precious about this. One of the fascinating things about my book is that I tell the story in great detail about how, when he makes these edits, and then about how his staff stabs him in the back because he doesn't follow their preferred line.
But yeah, you write a lot about that in the book, which when I was working for you at the time and remember being mad reading about the stabbing in the back that appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and on the news, the nightly news. So that was fascinating to me. And I literally could not read this book at night before I went to bed because it got me so mad all over again. I was all worked up. So I can only read during the day. But how, and there's a lot of effort to water down your comments and Reagan himself. How serious was the battle for the heart and soul of Ronald Reagan, and where did Nancy Reagan come down in all this?
It's hard to know what role she played in, let's say, the '84 campaign on this, because I don't know if there was a silent role or not. That I was never able to ascertain. I don't know that she had to. I think that instinctively, Dick Wirthlin and Darman and Baker, the three of them instinctively felt that Reagan needed to take a softer line in his speeches. Baker instructed me not to mention Mondale's name during the campaign of 1984, and Wirthlin was so nervous about attacking the Democrats that he felt we'd lose the blue collar vote if we attacked the Democrats, and we'd force them to go run back to the party, and they'd go back to Mondale. And then he was constantly nervous about the age issue, so that anytime we talked about anything that remotely referred to something that could suggest anything about Reagan's age, it made Wirthlin so nervous. And then Darman, of course, being sort of a moderate himself, thought that you should never attack the Democrats. Now, Darman knew nothing about politics. I mean, he was a political idiot. I mean, idiot in the sense that he was amateurish, and he had no business being in the role that he had. But all of them really believed it would be counterproductive for Reagan to get into a jousting match with the Democrats. And Reagan eventually, after being attacked repeatedly by Mondale, I mean, Reagan was leading Mondale substantially in that first week of October. So in desperation, Mondale started viciously attacking him. I discuss that in the book. I call it the chapter "Mommy Strikes Back," when Mondale made vicious personal accusations against the president, and so Mrs. Reagan finally, because clearly the president himself got angry about this and upset, and probably over the tray table at dinner or pillow talk, complained to Mrs. Reagan, and then she took the bullwhip to Baker and on Air Force One and said, "Look, this has got to end. Ronnie's complaining that he can't mention Mondale in his speeches." And when she was blaming me for that, I refused to take after getting beat up for about 5 minutes on this. I refused to take the blame, and finally told her who the culprit was, and that's when she called in Baker and bullyragged him, and said it's going to stop. But I don't think she was. I don't think necessarily she was involved in trying to water things down. But it's hard to know which hand she was playing at any given time. I mean, she may have been on the side of. I know where she was in 1988. She didn't want him to attack the Democrats in the '88 convention speech. But if she played that role in '84, it was unspoken.
When you
Well,
were writing speeches for President Reagan, and when others did as well, came in and left the White House, did the speechwriters have personal meetings generally with the president to discuss speeches, or was it a top-down staff kind of thing?
I think I know whenever I worked with him, I got personal one-on-one time. I know my replacement for that period, Aaron Bakshin, and then I think even Ben Elliott, they were able to get staff meetings where they bring in the whole staff to get sit downs with the president to discuss some speeches. But I don't. That's it's not quite the same. But Darman, Darman couldn't wait to get get a hold of the whole speechwriting operation. He was desperate, and when he was so happy when Gergen left, Gergen wanted control of speechwriting after I left, and then Darman was desperate to control it because he knew that if he could control speechwriting, he could make sure nothing got past him that would pollute the policy goals that he had in mind. So when Darman took over, he would require, like he asked of me for the '84 convention speech. He wanted an outline. He liked to get outlines. He was such a policy one, he was a former McKinsey consultant. Such a typical policy-oriented guy that, which was sort of meaningless. I mean, I never submitted outlines to Reagan for speeches. That's so stupid. But that's the kind of thing Darman wanted from the speechwriting staff. And I really don't know how the relationship worked, but I think they were all probably pleased when Darman left to go to the Treasury Department with Baker.
Yeah, so Jim Baker was the chief of staff. Dick Darman was the deputy chief of staff. Dick Wirthlin was as a pollster that overstepped. They were obviously undermining Reagan's policy goals. This is the thing that bedeviled all of us back then. Why did Reagan keep them around if they were substituting their own agenda for his agenda?
That's a good question. Probably Baker convinced them that the president had to be seen to be achieving, to getting things done, to having a record of achievements. I think that's Karen Timmelty points this out in her book, and this is and I point out to some extent in my book how Baker was goal oriented and wanted to show that there was a record of achievement, and convince the president, look, we've got to accommodate in order to get things done. And then in these conversations with me, he said, look, Ken, we've got to get this stuff passed, because we've also got all these very important foreign policy things and defense things that are on the agenda. And so that if the president can't appear to look weak in his relationship with the Congress, he made it sound like that if we didn't get things passed on domestic issues, that president would look weak on defense and foreign policy. So anyway, he was a very smooth operator, and I think he was very convincing to the president. Plus, they misled him. They just frankly misled him, especially on the 1982 tax bill. They all lied. They just all flat lied to the Stockman, and it was also Stockman. They just lied to the president and saying, you're going to get $3 of budget cuts for every dollar of tax increase. He kept them around because a lot of it was because he wasn't getting the truth. He thought that he was, they convinced him he was getting a good deal out of this whole thing. And plus he was not confrontational. He didn't like to fire people, and he didn't, and Baker was the chief of staff. If anybody was going to fire anybody, it was Baker. I mean, who was going to fire Baker? The only one that could fire Baker was Mommy. And Mommy got co-opted by Baker and Deaver. And all of them convinced and Baker was constantly in communication with Deaver to make sure Deaver was on board. and they elbowed Ed Meese out, who could be the only contradicting force, and they also got Stu Spencer in on it to make sure Stu was part of was in agreement with them that they had to get all this stuff done. And as far as Stu was concerned, it was his interest not to have any problems going into the '84 campaign.
Ken, you've got these two great sets of experiences. You have many more, but the ones that you focus most on in your book are your work with two presidents. And it's clear that you admired both presidents. But at the same time, how different they were, my gosh, in personality and in policy. Do a little tabulation comparison for us. What do you think the positive qualities were in each man and how they differed? You already touched on some of these. And then also any shortcomings you might want to mention in each president and how those shortcomings compared and contrasted between the two.
Well, obviously, Nixon's had enormous strengths in terms of his vast experience he brought to his whole career, starting as a young congressman, and right out of the box, he created an extraordinary record of bringing down Alger Hiss, which was a two-edged sword. The two-edged sword was he had great success, but he also created great enemies. And then became, the young vice president at age 39, and from there on began this extraordinary career. Narrowly lost the presidency in '60, but nevertheless began the groundwork for someone who became an extraordinary statesman on the one hand, and also one of the shrewdest political thinkers in America, shrewd and an extraordinary strategist and thinker who knew his way around seemingly every congressional district in the country. Had in a discussion with Nixon, he could start bringing up stories about Charlie Halleck in Indiana, or Thurston Morton in Kentucky, or going back to history about some senator in Wayne Morris in Oregon and Carl Munton in South Dakota. So he had this extraordinary background, and these strengths. When you bring these strengths into the presidency, you have such a magnificent history. I think maybe his weakness was, I don't know, it is probably not being less in touch with, in terms of the campaign stuff, depending a little too much, being so focused on his what he was doing policy-wise and everything else. I think he would keep in touch with what was going on in the campaign and being involved, but in '72 he let go what his normal instincts would be and lost touch a little bit. Reagan's big strengths were obviously his communication skills, and he had also what most people don't realize about him was the extraordinary years of experience that he had connecting with the American people through the days he had with General Electric, the tramping all through America. I can't give you the exact years it was, as the late '50s and early '60s, but whatever the exact years were, that he was a spokesman for General Electric. But he did travel the entire country, speaking on behalf of General Electric. That kind of experience put him in touch with people in a way that is very rare in American politics, because a lot of times he was on his own, lonely hotel rooms, writing writing speeches on his own, connecting with people at conventions. I mean, he just wasn't hobnobbing with businessmen at all these meetings. He was at local small group meetings in communities. He talked to me about being a master of ceremonies like the Pillsbury Bake Off and seeing how the IRS would come in and confiscate the winnings of these ladies who had won these contests to provide recipes. And so he had a great common touch with the American people that few people understand about Reagan. They view him as this highly polished actor, but at his core he was a small town. He's still a small town boy from Dixon. The weakness, I think, it was that he allowed the people around him to make decisions that the fellas he would leave up to them to make decisions that in the end sometimes he didn't agree with, and particularly like the 82 the tax bill, and he was non-confrontational, and there were probably people around him that he should have fired that he didn't. And that culminated in 1986 with the Iran-Contra, where he sort of lost his sight on the ball. And when it finally did take place, it took him a while to get control of it because he wasn't on top of it. And he, unlike Nixon, he was very difficult. He was hard to get to know, get to be close with. Very few people around Reagan created a bond with him. People people looked at Reagan and thought, well, this is a guy that probably everybody on his staff, was like one big happy family, and they all loved each other, and he loved them, and he knew everybody by name, and that's far from the truth. He probably only was connected to a small handful of people on his staff, I think me being one of them. I think one of the problems were like people like Darman. Darman was and Gergen and some of these fellows were just like isolated people that were unfamiliar to him and cold and indifferent, were sort of cold and indifferent figures in his life. That he would, he knew who they were, but then he really didn't know who they were. That if he never really had, he didn't feel comfort with them or close to them, and so that's why when there was a crisis, I got called in because I think he felt comfortable with me.
Hey, Ken. Well, we want to be respectful of your time. This hour is.
I filibustered a little bit.
Every word was gold, just like your speeches. So, but in wrapping up, we just want to ask how the book's been received so far. Particularly, is there anyone that's mad at you for the book? Is anyone looking at the knives out for you now that you've torn the cover off what Washington's really like? Especially considering how fragile Washington egos can be.
It's interesting. Nobody has. I haven't heard from anybody. Of course, some of the folks are dead, but the folks who are alive have not complained overtly to me. I anticipated some. I think some of it may be happening quietly. The Washington Post won't do a review. I've tried several times to reach out to them. And the fellow who does the reviews for the Post won't answer my emails. And I've reached out to friends at the Post and to a couple of editors, and they sort of shuffle me off. And I get the feeling that word has been passed that they don't want much attention given to the book. It could be because they don't want any competition for this Max Boot book that's come out. And he does a column for the Post periodically, and so they don't want competition. But I do think I'm not a conspiratorial guy, but so there could be some of that. The New York Times, I don't know, I'm not sure if we had a submission to the Times, but anyway, there haven't been major review. I got a great review in the Wall Street Journal, and National Review just did a review, but I'm just not getting the kind of attention that I think, given the fact that this is the rare book about Reagan and Nixon that's out there, actually written by someone who's still alive, that was there, and telling a story with contemporaneous notes and providing information that hasn't been told by anyone before anywhere. And it's fresh and interesting. And my colleagues, I'm getting great reports from. I'm hearing from people that unexpectedly, I don't want to name names, but people saying, "Boy, am I glad you've taken on these people in the White House. I'm glad, boy, they deserve what you're saying," and they've repeated to me stories about some of the people I've mentioned, and so some of our former colleagues have actually read the whole book, and I'm getting feedback, and you two are my friends, so. And you've told me how readable it is and how it is a page turner, but I'm getting that from a lot of people, that it's interesting and compelling and readable, and so that's why it's bothered me that I haven't gotten more national attention. And I've tried to get through to some of our conservative friends to cover it, and I think I've been out of the public eye for a long time, so. And still, I think it's an important book. I think part of it's a potential political roadmap for Republicans if they would just read it. The chapters where Reagan talks about the economy and cutting taxes and how to approach communication and everything else. I think it's a roadmap for Republicans. And I have done a copy for Speaker Johnson, and Newt Gingrich did a podcast for me, and he's been very enthusiastic. So, but no, it's a long answer. No, I have not gotten any negative feedback, but it's an honest book. A friend of mine, I can give you his name, Dwight Chapin, who wrote The President's Man, another great book about President Nixon, and Dwight said, "Look, if you're going to write a book, I was about 2/3 of the way through it," and he said, if you're going to do it right, make an honest account." And so I decided to write an honest account, and it is an honest portrayal. There was no sense to write a puff piece or to cut corners or to take the edge off of things, and it's a very honest portrayal. And very frankly, I was very bothered when some of the other biographies came out, and especially the one about Jim Baker, the man who ran Washington, and then I read Darman's biography and autobiography, and some of the others, and some of these oral histories I read. And they there's twists of history that really troubled me a great deal. And my book is based on, my book is based on record and history and diaries, and it's footnoted, and I retrieved a record that no one else has retrieved. And that was that Sarah Fritz, who was a reporter for U.S. News and World Report, left her notebooks, White House notebooks. She left them to the National Archives, and nobody else had accessed them. And these were the off the record backgrounders and that she had with the White House with Gergen and Fuller and Baker and Darman and Rich Williamson and others. And boy, are they revealing. And those are quoted in the book. So it rips the scab off of what was going on.
Well, I tore through it, Ken. I lost sleep because I couldn't put it down. And I don't, even people who don't happen not to like Nixon or Reagan, I don't see how they could ignore this book, because for one thing, you include in there actual copies of memoranda
right
that President Nixon wrote and sent through you to the Reagan operation. And anybody, any historian, could not be able to write a complete record without accessing your book and those memos, and then your well-documented memories.
Well, that's the other hidden story. It's the hidden thread throughout the book that bothers me, that it's being ignored. Especially by like the Post or the New York Times, that it's a massive. I mean, it's a history book that the all these so-called John Meacham, Brinkley, and all these guys who are supposed to be big presidential historians. They don't have any of this stuff, and yet they write books and get reviewed all the time.
Yeah.
And, my book's a real contribution to the history of the last quarter century of American politics, and it's being ignored. And I guess I can cry crying in my beer to you guys, but it is troublesome.
Well, it is a no holds barred book, no question about it, and it gives you a real appreciation for how Washington really works, how the White House really works, and it's not the West Wing, that's for sure.
And what's the book called, Gary?
The book is called Behind Closed Doors: In the Room with Nixon and Reagan. You can find out more about it at www.reaganandnixon.com. Our guest is Ken Khachigian, and it's available on Amazon, everywhere else. Thanks, Ken, for joining us today. We'll be back. Jim and I will be back soon to discuss the new Reagan biopic, which Jim has seen, and I guess Ken has seen, but I haven't seen yet. So we'll be podcasting about that next. So I want to say thank you, Ken. Jim, any last words, the two of you?
It's great to see Ken again and doing well. And we've been waiting for this book for a long time, and it's finally here.
Absolutely.
And it did not disappoint.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ken.
And Gary even got his name in it.
I know. I just want to point out that I did the very thing that everyone in Washington does.
You did the Washington
word
read.
of it. I went to the index. I've got mentioned 3 times in there. Then I went to Robinson, 0 mentions. So
although I would say that knowing Ken Khachigian, if I looked at the index and didn't see my name, I'd be relieved.
Well, Noel Cook refers to that as the Washington read. He admitted he got the book, and I sent it to him, and he said, I did the Washington read first and look for my.
All right. Well, thank you again, and we'll be back again soon. Bye-bye.
All right.